Some people spend their entire lives preparing to become someone great and still die as the person they used to be. Not because they lacked talent, knowledge, or opportunity, but because when life finally asked them to take one real step into the unknown, they hesitated. And sometimes, one moment of hesitation is enough to keep a person ordinary forever. Let me tell you a story about that. There was once a man who had spent most of his life chasing success. And to be fair, he had achieved it. He built wealth, owned a large home, earned people's respect, and gave his family a comfortable life. From the outside, everything looked complete. But deep inside, something was missing. One evening, his entire family gathered together for dinner. As the night went on, the older members of the family began sharing stories about brave men from generations before them. One spoke about a grandfather who fought off bandits during a journey through the mountains. Another told the story of an uncle who survived alone in the wilderness for days. Someone else laughed as they described a relative who once hunted dangerous animals with nothing but courage and instinct. The room was alive with admiration. Every story carried weight. Every memory carried respect. And while everyone listened with excitement, the man became strangely quiet, because for the first time in years, he realized something painful. No one would ever tell a story like that about him. Nobody would sit in a room years after his death and speak about his courage. They would talk about his business, his money, maybe even his success, but not bravery, not greatness, not the kind of life that inspires people. And the more he sat there listening, the more it bothered him. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, he sat awake alone thinking about his life. He realized something terrifying. He had spent decades building comfort, but almost no time building courage. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, he made a decision. He would hunt a lion. Now, why a lion? Because to him, nothing else symbolized courage more than that. A lion represented danger, fear, and power. To hunt one meant proving something, not just to other people, but to himself. In his mind, if he could do this one thing, he would finally become the man he always wished he was. He imagined returning home victorious. He imagined the lion's skin laid across the floor of his home, guests staring at it in amazement, children listening to stories about his bravery years later. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive. So he committed himself completely. The next morning, his preparation began. He bought books on hunting and survival. He studied lions obsessively. How they move, how they stalk prey, how hunters track them in the wild. He trained with weapons until his hands became steady. He exercised daily, pushing his body harder than he ever had before. He practiced patience, discipline, and endurance. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Nearly an entire year passed. And honestly, most people would have quit halfway through because preparation sounds exciting at first, until it becomes repetitive, exhausting, and lonely. But he kept going. Every day of training made him feel closer to becoming the courageous man he had imagined. And finally, the day arrived. Before sunrise, he stood in his room putting on his hunting gear. He packed food, water, weapons, and supplies. Everything he would need for the journey ahead. His heart was racing, but this time he welcomed the feeling because fear made the moment feel real. As he prepared to leave, his wife woke up and saw him standing near the door. Still half asleep, she asked, "Where are you going?" The man stood taller than usual, almost proudly, and replied, "I'm going to hunt a lion." For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then slowly, admiration appeared in her eyes, because even she could feel that something about him was different now. So she walked closer, smiled softly, and said, "Be careful. Come back safe." He nodded confidently, opened the front door, and stepped outside. This was it, the moment he had imagined for an entire year. the moment his ordinary life would finally end. But only a few minutes later, the front door opened again. It was him. His wife looked confused. "You're back already? What happened?" The man avoided eye contact for a moment before quietly saying, "A dog is barking outside. It doesn't feel safe to leave right now." And that is the part of the story most people never forget. Not because it's funny, but because it's painfully true. This man spent an entire year preparing to face a lion. He studied, trained, learned, and planned. He built every skill necessary for the challenge ahead. But when the moment finally came to step into uncertainty, a barking dog was enough to send him back inside. Not the lion, not the jungle, not the real danger, just the feeling of fear. And that is exactly how most people live. They dream about greatness. They talk about becoming more, plan for years, learn for years, and prepare endlessly. They wait until they feel ready. But when life finally places an opportunity in front of them, they retreat. Not because they can't do it, but because fear suddenly becomes real. A little criticism scares them. A little failure shakes them. A little uncertainty makes them question everything. So they turn around and call it being practical. But deep down, they know the truth. The truth is that knowledge was never the problem. Most people already know enough to begin. And preparation usually isn't the problem either. The real problem is courage. Because courage is not something you magically feel before taking action. Courage is what appears after you decide to move despite fear. That man prepared himself to hunt a lion, but he never prepared himself to walk through fear. And those are two completely different things. Some people spend their whole lives preparing so they never have to truly act because preparation feels safe. Action does not. Preparation keeps your dreams alive without risking failure. But action tests who you really are. And that's why so many people stay stuck exactly where they are. Not because life stopped them, but because fear convinced them to stop themselves. So listen carefully. Your life will eventually present you with a moment where you either step forward or retreat back into comfort. And in that moment, who you become will be decided. Because the difference between ordinary people and extraordinary people is often much smaller than we think. Sometimes, it's simply the willingness to keep walking when fear tells you to turn around. So ask yourself honestly, what have you been preparing for that you still haven't dared to begin?